this guide, we'll go over everything you need to know to be able to read and understand tooltips in Final Fantasy XIV. This does include some of the details that are not even written directly in the tooltips. I will explain how to read tooltips based on examples, and these examples will start very simple and then we move on to more and more complex actions to make sure you know how to read even the super complicated tooltips. Now then, every job has at least one weapon skill or spell that simply does damage and can be used as much as you like. The Lancer's True Thrust will serve as the weapon skill example, while the Arcanist's Ruin will serve as the spell example. You can identify a weapon skill or spell by the tooltip denoting this just below the actual action name. And both weapon skills and spells fall under the more generally accepted concept known as Global Cooldowns, which I cover in more detail in this separate video. The range denotes how far away you can be while using the action, meaning that True Thrust has a range of 3 yalms and Ruin has a range of 25 yalms. The radius denotes whether there is an area of effect on the attack. This radius can be confusing, as line-shaped area attacks also use this number, but not to determine the width of the line, just the length of the line. Next, the cast value determines how long you have to actively spend time casting the attack, where instant means that the only time you need to dedicate is the animation log of about half a second when casting instant actions. Actions with cast time is more commonly seen on spells, but is not exclusive to spells, a prominent example being the Samurai's EI Jutsus. The concept known as slide casting allows you to start moving about half a second before the action finishes casting. The recast time is what is more commonly known as the cooldown of an action. Most weapon skills and spells have a cooldown of 2.5 seconds or less. This is what is commonly referred to as the global cooldown, as all of your weapon skills and spells will simultaneously go on this cooldown when you use just one of them. There are weapon skills and spells with cooldowns longer than 2.5 seconds, but we will get back to those later. The cooldown generally determines how long you have to wait before you can use an action again, and for weapon skills and spells, they tend to just show the general global cooldown, which is equivalent to saying that they don't really have one. A thing that cast times and global cooldowns have in common is that the stats skill speed and spell speed can reduce these numbers. Finally, if a weapon skill or spell has an MP cost, this is also noted. Now, that is all the basic information always shown in a weapon skill or spell. Now we go on to reading the action's text. True Thrust simply does an attack of 170 potencies worth of damage, and Ruin does 240 potency. Potencies are values used to compare attacks between each other, but not across jobs. 100 potency on a white mage is not necessarily going to mean the same thing as 100 potency on a samurai. This means that you can tell that the Lancer's Piercing Talon attack does less damage than True Thrust simply by comparing their potencies. Additionally, you can tell that Ruin does magic damage instead of physical damage because it explicitly states the kind of aspect of damage it does, even though it is unaspected, meaning non-elemental damage. This is sometimes relevant. Next, let's look at some very basic area of effect attacks, namely the Dragoon's Doom Spike and Arcanist's Outburst, starting with Outburst. Outburst's text specifically denotes that it hits your target and all enemies nearby it, which is how you can tell that its area of effect is a circle. Now, every enemy in the area will take 100 potencies worth of damage. It is as simple as that. This also means that if you compare Ruin and Outburst, Outburst wins when there are at least 3 targets, since 3 times 100 is 300. If an area attack has no range, then it is implied that it is centered on yourself, like with most tank area of effect attacks. Doomspike, on the other hand, denotes that it hits all enemies in a straight line before you. This means that the radius value will always be equal to the range, and that the width is not actually stated anywhere in the tooltip. You simply have to learn this from testing. Now, Doomspike does 110 potency on every target, meaning that it beats True Thrust on merely 2 targets. However, due to how combo actions work, there are more factors to consider than that. How many targets are necessary before you should switch to area of effect is something I cover in more detail in my job guide videos separately, in case you are interested. But for now, let's move on to looking at a combo action. If you played a mage or healing job primarily, then you might not be very well acquainted with combo actions, as these are almost never seen on those roles. Let's look at the Lancer's Disembowel as a great example. Once again, we see it is a weapon skill, the recast time suggests it is the global cooldown, and we get to the text. The tooltip states that Disembowel just does 100 potency. Now below this line we see combo action true thrust. This means if the weapon skill or spell we cast just before this one was true thrust, then all of the things that follow below this line happens. First, the combo potency means that the 100 potency is replaced with 210 potency. Additionally, the action also gives us the power surge buff, and then the tooltip goes on to explain what that is. Typically, this kind of sub-tooltip tends to finish with the duration of the effect, so if anything followed after the duration of power surge, then that would be continuing the explanation of disembowel. Just to build a little more on this combo action concept, let's also look at Chaos Thrust, a step 3 combo action. Similarly, it also opens with 100 potency, but then adds that it instead does 140 potency if performed from the rear of the enemy. Now, this one says that it is a combo action with Disembowel. While this tooltip suggests that you could use Disembowel not as a follow-up action after True Thrust and then combo Chaos Thrust, this is incorrect. When you use an action like Disembowel, but not following its combo action, it will not count as Disembowel and will not boost Chaos Thrust either. Now, we can see that Chaos Thrust jumps to 220 potency or 260 from the rear, and then it also applies a damage over time effect. This damage over time effect does 40 potency and has a duration of 24 seconds. How do damage over time effects, and heal over time effects for that matter, work? While one such effect is active on someone, every 3 seconds they apply the potency listed. This means that Chaos Thrust's damage over time effect does 40 potency 8 times, and say White Mage's Regen does 200 potency 6 times. There exist a few actions in the game that hit more often than every 3 seconds, but they are content specific. Several PvP actions hit every 2 seconds. Often, this can be identified by actions having a duration that is not a multiple of 3, and then there's Sage's Mesotis that just breaks all the rules. Anyway, back to Chaos Thrust. After the duration, it denotes that it also grants the Wheel in Motion buff, and that it ends if you cast any weapon skill. The only purpose Wheel in Motion serves is that it allows access to the weapon skill Wheeling Thrust, which is not exactly a combo action, but is designed this way because you can combo into this action from 2 different directions. It is simply easier to understand that 2 actions grant the buff enabling it. Now, some weapon skills and spells exist with unusual recast timers, including cooldowns. For these, there are 5 excellent examples. Let's start with the Gunbreaker's Gnashing Fang. Because Gnashing Fang is a weapon skill, it incurs the global cooldown, but the line at the bottom that states that this weapon skill does not share recast timer with any other actions is meant to be understood as, no, the global cooldown incurred will not be 30 seconds, don't worry. The 30-second cooldown is exclusively just Gnashing Fang itself. Another new thing is the cartridge cost denoted at the bottom. You will only be able to use this action if you have a cartridge resource. Now, Gnashing Fang also has its cooldown reduced by skill speed. This is another feature that is not described anywhere in the tooltip. This is however something shared among all weapon skills and spells with a longer cooldown, but only if they have a recast time. I will get back to this in a bit. In fact, take a look at the Arcanist's Aether Charge. It does not state that it does not share cooldown with any other actions like Gnashing Fang does, but it does work in the exact same way. Simply put, if a weapon skill or spell has a longer cooldown than 2.5, then it will explicitly state if it does apply to your other weapon skills or spells. Speaking of which, the Monk's 6-sided star is the single one action that forces your global cooldown to become longer than 2.5 seconds. This is denoted by the text, upon execution, the recast timer for this action will be applied to all other weapon skills and magic actions. For the opposite effect, Sage's Eucrasia and Machinist's Heat Blast are spells and weapon skills that have shorter recast times than 2.5 seconds. These will enforce the global cooldown as their cooldown, and additionally will be unaffected by skill speed and spell speed as denoted by the line, Recast timer cannot be affected by status effects or gear attributes. This is common on actions with 1.5 or less seconds of cooldown. Sometimes, two actions will share the same cooldown between them, with a great example being Machinist's Drill and Bioblaster actions. These actions tend to either name drop the actions they share with, or it is implied in some way, like with Ninja's Mudras. Which also leads us to charge-based actions. As a good example, Sage's Phlegma replaces its recast timer with a charge time, which is the amount of time that needs to pass to generate a charge. When you have a charge, you can use Phlegma, and as denoted in the bottom of the tooltip, you can hold a maximum of 2 charges. Also note that even with spell speed, Phlegma's charge time is still 45 seconds, because spell speed only affects recast time and not charge time. Now we are ready to talk about abilities. Abilities stand out from weapon skills and spells as these actions don't incur the global cooldown and are unaffected by it. For this reason, they tend to also go by the name of global cooldown. Abilities can have all of the same information as a weapon skill or spell, with the exception that they rarely, if ever, have combo actions attached or cast times. You may have already noticed that if you try to use multiple abilities at the same time, or even try to use abilities at the same time as weapon skills or spells, some of the actions will not happen at all, or they will happen in some random order with a set time between each. The animation lock I mentioned briefly at the start is causing this. Every instant action incurs about half a second plus some of your latency of animation lock where you cannot issue other actions. Some actions take even longer, like drinking potions. Actions with cast times instead incur their animation lock as the last half second of the cast time, which is where you become able to slide around since the game system has already decided that you finished your cast. How exactly this plays into how you use your actions I go into more detail with in that previously mentioned guide on global cooldowns and more, as well as in my job guides. So if you want more detail on how to use your job's actions optimally, refer to those. As abilities can do all of the things I already explained about weapon skills and spells, let's take a few extremely convoluted abilities as examples for practice. The warrior's Nascent Flash action does a lot of things, including your laundry, dinner and homework, but understanding how it works exactly can be difficult. First, it grants you Nascent Flash and your target, our friend, Nascent Glint. Nascent Flash heals every time you produce a damage number from a weapon skill, and it heals for 400 potency. Nascent Glint instead heals for exactly the same number that Nascent Flash healed for, but additionally reduces damage taken by 10%. Now, the 8-second duration applies to both Nascent Flash and Nascent Glint. Since the duration is denoted, it means we are now back to reading the Nascent Flash ability tooltip and not the sub-tooltip. An additional effect is that it also grants your target, the one getting Nascent Glint, the Stem the Flow effect, which also reduces damage taken by 10%, but only lasts 4 seconds. It also grants your target Stem the Tide, which is a shield worth 400 potency of healing, and it lasts 20 seconds. And finally, Nascent Flash shares its cooldown with Bloodwetting, the slightly easier to understand self-targeting version of the same ability. Another important example to look at are area attacks with varying damage. The Dragoon's Stardiver is a decent example. At the bottom we see a few restrictions. You cannot use it if you're bound, means that if you are rooted to the floor you cannot use this. It is also only available during the buff window known as Life of the Dragon. Now, Stardiver deals a whopping 620 potency of damage, but only to the main target. All other targets take 30% less, meaning 434 potency. Most attacks that have these kinds of properties with varying damage values are attacks that are great both for single target and area of effect. The damage is inflated for single target so that it is worth using, while the extra targets take less so that the attack isn't too strong in that situation. This is far more common on abilities than weapon skills and spells, because abilities are not restricted by the global cooldown. There is nothing preventing you from using an area of effect attack on a single enemy for free bonus damage. Finally, let's look at the one common damage over time effect that hits every second, Machinist's Flamethrower. Clearly, the tooltip does not state anywhere that it hits more often than usual, and the only way to know is to count damage numbers appearing. This means that Flamethrower does 800 potency over 10 seconds. Another interesting aspect about Flamethrower is that it is an ability that triggers the weapon skill cooldown when used, meaning that Flamethrower acts like a weapon skill despite being an ability. Flamethrower is also a cone attack, the third area of effect option, meaning the radius denotes the length of the cone in front of you, but the width of the cone is not stated. Finally, Flamethrower is also what can be considered a channeled ability, as it cancels if you do anything. To summarize what we learned, every tooltip has a type, weapon skill, spell or ability, a range denoted in yalms as well as a radius denoted in yalms. Line and cone area of effect attacks are unreliable regarding the radius. Every tooltip has a cast time and either a recast time or a charge time, and if there is an MP cost, then that is also denoted. Then, the text portion of a tooltip can be read from top to bottom, with adjustments made to things like potencies being stated literally as what they are changed to. Sub-tooltips describing effects done by the action are typically punctuated and ended with a duration, allowing us to see when the sub-tooltip ends and the tooltip resumes. Potencies are values that can be used to compare the power between two actions of the same job. Area of effect attacks denote how much damage they do to every target, meaning that it is as easy as counting the number of enemies to know how much potency of damage they do. Combo-based actions state which action you need to use before it to gain the vast majority of its effects, and such an action is only counted as actually used if you use it correctly, meaning as a combo. So you cannot cheat and use a step 2 into a step 3 without getting the step 1. Damage over time and healing over time effects hit for their potencies every 3 seconds with very few exceptions. While some weapon skills and spells have longer cooldowns, they will explicitly state it if this affects your other actions. And while abilities don't get affected by the global cooldown, they may sometimes explicitly state that they do incur it and are thus affected by it. And finally, all actions incur an animation lock, preventing you from using more than one action every half second, regardless of cooldowns. That is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you feel at least slightly better equipped to read how your actions work in Final Fantasy XIV, and if you do, consider liking the video. You can also subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when next I post a video. If you have any questions or anything to add, please leave a comment down below. Fun fact, many of the area of effect attacks that do varying damage used to work in a much more convoluted way. For example, Flare would do its potency to the first target, 15% less to the second, 30% less to the third, 45% less to the fourth, 60% less to the fifth, and 70% less to everything beyond that, making it extremely difficult to understand exactly how much damage it would even do.